Hi there, Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today we're going to play with some markers. You can use whatever markers you have at home to play along, and I want to try some fun techniques with this one, and I thought I would take you along for the journey. So I started off with a sketch with a light pink colored pencil on my marker paper. This is the Ohuhu Marker pad, the hardcover one that's got the paper's got it's smooth, but it's just got enough texture that I can do colored pencils on top. So I like this paper a lot because it does allow me to do some mixed media and it blends really well. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Whenever you're on a type of cardstock that blends really well, you probably want to have something underneath it because it will bleed through. Your ink needs to stay wet for blending basically, and your paper needs to be a little absorbent, and this paper is. If you're working on like a bleed-proof paper or like a thinner marker paper, you're going to have some different results. For anytime I'm doing something like a portrait or I want to get blending, I make sure I use like a cardstock or like this marker paper that will facilitate the blending. The markers I'm using are from the illustration set of 60 Honolulu S series, which is I think their latest type of marker they've come out with, and it features your typical Honolulu brush on one end and a flexible soft chisel nib on the other end. And I was getting a feel for these markers. It's the first time I've used them, and I kind of wanted to see what they would be best for. And I determined in this that they are best for things where you want to model, and you'll see when I go and do the hat, where you want to kind of model volumetric textured things, but not so much for blending. But I'll have another project coming out with them on my YouTube channel coming up soon, if it's not out already, of a landscape that I did with these, because I think that the soft chisel nib's best for that. But anyway, I'm mostly using the brush on this example, so if you have any of the brush markers, they're going to work really well for you. Now I got the legs a little dark here because her legs did appear to be a little more tan and also a little more shadowed, but I did notice I got them a little too dark, but that's all right because I'll be able to tweak my tones a bit with colored pencils in a little while. So that's another reason I like this paper. It's got that little bit of texture that will allow me to also add colored pencil on top. But if you have a cardstock you like, that's going to be just fine. I just am really used to using this paper, and I think with alcohol markers, it's got the steepest learning curve, so I would recommend find a paper you like and just really get used to that paper, and you're going to have better results with your marker. If you jump around from paper to paper all the time, it can slow your learning down. So that would just be my tip. You find a cardstock you like or you have a lot of and you're not afraid to use, then just keep using that. You'll get used to how much it bleeds out on that and where you need to pull it back in from your drawing lines to keep it from over bleeding and how it blends and all of that. You know, it's just kind of whatever you get used to, you're going to end up doing well on. I am using the chisel nib here for the hair because I didn't want to get too much ink to flow. The chisel nib, this chisel nib does flow more ink than the other harder chisel nibs because it's got that flex to them, but it doesn't flow as much as the brush nib. So anytime I need to get like a detail or a crisp edge, I usually will go to the end that does not flow as much ink. Now, blending happens with the amount of ink you have. It's not a pressure thing. The more ink, the more blending. Just kind of keep that in mind. And then you can see how I'm using the chisel nibs to model this hat to give it some structure. I think it works really well for that. And I'm also using the chisel nib to make this pattern on her shirt, which you could use any chisel nib for that, honestly. My advice is when you get a new supply, like I'm using here with these markers, is that you use it on a paper you're comfortable with, so you have some sort of control element in your artwork, and then you just play. You play with it, you play with drawing different subject matter, you play with drawing using different colors, different blends, see how it works for detail, see how it works for coloring broad areas, and just get a feel for how that may integrate with the other supplies you already have. Because when you add a new supply to your stash, ideally, it makes your other supplies more versatile rather than just replacing what you already have. Now, if you already have alcohol markers and you're perfectly happy with them and you don't see the benefit to having another chisel nib, then you can pass on these. Use whatever you have. But if you're like, oh, you know what, I do love to use my chisel nibs, but I just wish they had a little bit more give to them. I wish I could be a little bit more expressive with them. I wish I had a little bit of flex. Then this might be a really nice option for you. They do have several size sets on these, so you can take a look and see what might be available to you, what you might like. I don't think they sell this version open stock, but maybe they will one day. It's an interesting marker, I have to say. One difference I noticed with this and the other Honolulu markers is that the gray band is on the soft chisel side, so I think that this marker is definitely geared to those that have a preference for the chisel end. just something to keep in mind if you are considering these markers. And I just wanted to draw like either a pair of roller skates or a roller skater or rollerblader or something. So I went to Unsplash and I just searched roller skates, and this picture came up, and I thought it was so fun. I loved the pose, and I love the architecture in the background. I actually wasn't sure when I started if I was going to put a background in. If I think I'm going to do a background when I am starting a painting, I will put the background in first. But if I'm not sure, then I won't. But the reason I do put a background in first, if I think I want one, is because sometimes putting the background in throws all your values off, and that was something that happened to me here, but you'll show how I was able to bring contrast back when we get to that point. And I think the tips and the techniques that I have towards the end of this video are a little bit different than what you typically see in a marker video, and I think they could be helpful if you're someone who likes to do markers. Now here I'm using a fine liner to just outline. This fine liner is a 0.45 millimeter, which is probably a little thick for this, especially using a black line, but I'd already started, so I decided to go with it. These are also a new marker from Ohuhu. They're a calligraphy, well, they're a soft brush. They have a, well, what would we say? They have a plastic, they're a plastic nibbed marker. So the brush nib is actually like this flexible plastic nib, kind of like a Tombow Fudonosuke pen, or sign pen. And you can vary your width by pressing the nib, and then it's got the fine liner on the other side, which is a fixed 0.45 millimeter nib, and that's what I'm using for this. And I have to say, I lost the cap the first time I used this pen, and it had been uncapped for a week, and it's still going. Like it hasn't been uncapped. So I'm hoping that stays fresh until I can find the cap anyway. But these pens are waterproof and alcohol marker proof. So if you wanted to use them for your initial sketch and then use watercolors or watercolor markers or alcohol-based markers, they won't smudge. Now I do my inking last because generally I am still working on the drawing as I'm coloring in. I sometimes need to nudge something. I realize I got a line wrong somewhere and I'll move it. So I wait till the end. And also if I get any bleed out with my marker, I can smooth it out with the fine lining at the end. So that's why I do that. But you can obviously do it either way with these pens. If you're using some random pen that you're not sure about, do it last just to be safe. You can also add little hints of color with some of the colored tones. The tones in this set are very they're very kind of tropical looking, I would say. There's a black, but then all the colors are very kind of like mid-range colors, not very dark. So I don't know how well they would do for outlining, unless you really like a pastel like outline. They do have kind of like a mid pastel to mid tone to them. They're not very dark at all. But it's kind of it's a pretty kind of fashion combination, I would say. And if you like a Tombow pen, you probably will like these. So just gives you some color options there anyway. And I'm adding some details with these just because with a 60 color illustration set, I didn't have as many shades as I typically would have, and I wanted to stick to those new materials just to kind of see how they behaved, and being able to go in with the fine liners was helpful. So here I was thinking, well, maybe I'll just put a grounding because I feel like she needed something to ground or like a shadow underneath her. And I immediately regretted it because I was like, oh, now I'm going to need to do the whole thing because this just looks awful. I grabbed some colored pencils just to help smooth out the skin tones. These are the Ohuhu Halawa color pencils. They came out, I think, probably about 6 months, maybe a little more than that ago. They're a fairly firm lead. Actually, I would consider them to be fairly firm because I'm typically working with the softer core pencils. But they're translucent. They're an oil base, so they're not super opaque, but they will just kind of nudge your colors a little bit as needed. They're not as opaque as a Prismacolor. They have a very similar laydown to a Polychromos. But you could use any colored pencils for this, seriously. It's just to kind of push those values a little bit, push your shadow, push your color so you get exactly where you want to, especially when you have a limited collection of markers. Having some colored pencils to help expand the colors that you have access to is really helpful, and also it can smooth out any areas where the blending wasn't that good. And then if your pencil looks grainy, you can go over with the alcohol marker, and the alcohol marker will break down the pencil and smooth that out too. So you can go back and forth with them. It's just keep in mind that the alcohol marker dissolves the pencil, and because of that it could clog up on the nib if you go over a heavily colored area with your alcohol marker. I really like the richness that adding colored pencil over marker gives. Like you can get that texture of fabric, you can get the smoothness of skin tone, you can just build up more luminosity. And I do it to most of my alcohol marker pictures, honestly. So it's just kind of something fun. Now I'm using a gel pen here. These are the Tiger gel pens. I like those a lot because you get 3 different nib sizes and they're very affordable and they have a ton of ink. Like the whole barrel is full of ink. So you get more ink than a typical gel pen. So I've been recommending that set. And here's a mistake. I started cleaning up some of the edges around my illustration where the ink had bled, but it didn't occur to me that I was putting a background in at this point. And alcohol marker just layers up over the white gel pen, but it kind of acts as a little bit of a resist, so it's going to be darker where the paper is and lighter where the pen was. So that's something that we're going to have to contend with, but actually what I ended up doing with it, I like the results of better. So here I'm just using T-square to divide up the area from the kind of boardwalk where she's scooched down, the water, the buildings, and then getting the divisions between the buildings there. So a T-square is so handy. Those are from Mr. Pen, and I got a 3-pack for like $6.99. I'll try to remember to link that up too. But that's great because I keep one at each of my art spaces, so I always have a T-square handy. And I love that 12-inch length because I can fit it on my desk. It doesn't bump into stuff, and it's perfect for sketchbooks because usually your sketchbooks are 9 by 12 or smaller, and that gives you plenty of length for spanning a page like that. So I'm just using the variety of kind of orangey brown brick colors that I have in this collection to build the boardwalk. I am pushing the colors a little bit because I like a more saturated color, and I'm giving a little shadow to that curb that's by the water. And I'm just basically putting in a background and hoping that it turns out okay. I wanted to pick up on the turquoise in the building windows and the water, so I'm throwing that in first in the water, and then I'm adding kind of a greenish gray color over to tone it down a bit. And there I see that, where I cleaned up on the bleed out of my marker by the hands, it is resisting the ink. And I thought, okay, I'm going to have to work with that. And then I thought, what about maybe making her look like she's a sticker? And so that's kind of where that idea came from. But we're not to that yet. But this is where I noticed that, that alcohol marker is completely it's resisted by that white pen. But not to worry. That's what learning about products are. That's why I don't recommend being too fussy or too precious about your new art supplies. Just play with them, because the chances are that first thing you make with a brand new art supply is not going to be fantastic. Maybe it will be fantastic, or maybe you'll just have so much fun that you'll feel like it's fantastic, but you have got to just let yourself go with the flow and learn how those materials work. Now I'm taking advantage of the chisel edge. Now you could use any chisel edge. It doesn't have to be these markers for this to get those straight architectural lines. I wanted a contrast between the organic human and the hard buildings, hard bricks, glossy water. I wanted to try to get a variety of textures and colors there. The sky in the background looks just about white, but I did want to have a little bit of color there because I wanted to have the bright white be the kind of sticker effect that I'm going to put around the girl. And I wanted to make sure that was going to really stand out. So that's why I gave some color to that background of the building there. And I wasn't even really sure if I liked what was going on here. I was feeling like it was getting all too mid-range, and I wasn't getting the contrast that I needed between the girl in the background. And I was trying to think about how I was going to overcome that. Was I going to use the markers to do a glaze over everything? What was I going to do here to make it fit and to use products that would work well together? So again, I'm smoothing some things out with my colored pencils because that's just a great way to use a product like that. You can always blend out with your white colored pencil, especially a white oil-based colored pencil, because it's not going to opacify it very much. Now here I am deciding I'm going to try outlining and making her look a little bit like a sticker. I wasn't quite committed to the idea yet, but I was just kind of going around with the, I think it was the 1mm Tiger pen. And I like the effect pretty well, but I decided that I was going to have to go a little bit bolder with that because I still didn't have the contrast that I wanted at that step. And then I was also thinking that the background was just too light. I needed to overall darken everything that wasn't the girl there, and then having that white outline would be much more impactful. So I remembered that I had this tool from back in the day that would let you spray your markers. So I thought, I'm going to make a mask of the girl here. Now, what I probably should have done was just laid down a piece of tracing paper and traced her, but I had these translucent sticky notes in there, so like a thin plastic, and so I just coated her with those, and very awkwardly, oh my word, I couldn't have done this more awkwardly if I tried, I don't think. And at first I thought I would be able to just take an X-Acto knife and cut around her. And maybe if I had used contact paper, I probably could have, but with all these different layers, I was worried I was going to cut through my paper, and I decided I would just go ahead and try tracing her. I first tried with a ballpoint pen, and then I'm like, nope, that's not drying. I'm just going to smudge it, make a mess. So I ended up going around her with a soft pencil and just like a graphite pencil, and then ended up cutting it up with scissors because I'm not great with an X-Acto knife, and at this point I really didn't want to ruin the picture, so I decided I would just cut it out with scissors and then stick it all back down there. And yeah, I used way more materials than I needed to for that. I had to tape the Post-it notes together, but we're gonna get there in the end. It's just a clumsy, and you get to see it, warts and all. You get to see how sometimes we have these awkward moments, but you can watch this and be like, you know what, if that happens to me, I'm going to take a piece of tracing paper and just tape it down there and trace around it, and that would be so much better. But, you know, that's just how your artwork goes sometimes. It's not a linear process. It rarely is a linear process from point A to point B. You usually start at point A, and then you take a detour, and then you backtrack, and you get there eventually, but a lot of times there's some detours. So now we're sticking this right back down, and I'm going to use that tool I was telling you about. Now, I had two different ideas. I thought I can either use an ink pad, like a stamping pad, and a brush, or I could use this little marker spritzer. So this was something I bought from Stampin' Up! Way back in the day, probably over 10 years ago. And then Tim Holtz came out with one a couple years ago. And basically there's a little holder there that you can put your marker in, and you can use any type of marker. There's a little adapter if you have a skinny marker, like a Tombow or whatever. And water-based, alcohol-based, doesn't really matter. You put it in there so the nib goes over the little hole at the end of the thing. Hopefully I can find these still. And then you just squeeze and it will spritz out a little puff of ink. It's kind of like a blow pen. Do you remember the blow pens back from when you were a kid? Same idea. So I peeled off the mask to check to see if it was dark enough, and I thought, no, I need it darker. I'm going to try my ink blending brush and an ink pad, and that's what I did here with a basic gray ink color, and that was a little bit better. And I think I decided to just go with it, and it allowed me to darken the paper enough so I could get a little more contrast when I redo the white line. Now I'm taking a gray marker, just kind of darkening the shadow under her a bit so I can really anchor her to the scene. And now, because I need a wide line, I'm going to go with an acrylic brush pen. Now I decided while I was at it, while I had this whole set out, that I would just go ahead and add some accents to her as well. So, because I figured if I gave her a little bit more opaqueness, that also would help give her some more contrast from the background. And that's what I felt it really needed. This definitely does not look like it took as long as it did. This took probably close to 2 hours, but I wanted to keep going until I was happy with the look of it. And at the end I was. So here I'm using the Ohuhu brush pen acrylic marker to just give her a wide band of color around her. Now, brush pens generally aren't as opaque as gel pens or hard tip pens, but I think it worked pretty well. And here you can see the final result. I'm really happy with it. It was a lot of fun to create, and I learned a lot about these products as I was using them. So I hope this inspires you to break out your products and give them a try. And till next time, happy crafting. Bye!